Hello and welcome to FinTech Talk. I'm your host, Charles Orton-Jones. Today, we're going to the heart of the tech part of FinTech. We're looking at APIs, application programming interfaces. As we know, APIs sit at the heart of everything that goes on in the FinTech universe. They connect applications and systems, and even within individual applications, which can be broken up into microservices, APIs connect the different chunks. But there's a question about security with APIs. There are a variety of implementations and methods when it comes to APIs, many of which are substandard, and some are so bad they're going to put organizations at risk. So what we're attempting here today in the next half an hour is to give you a masterclass in API security. We're going to be touching on issues such as FAPI, which is finance-grade API. We're going to look at the role of organizations such as OpenID and concepts such as OAuth 2.0. Hopefully by the end, you'll have a nuanced understanding of security in APIs. And most of all, you'll know what to do in your organization to upgrade your APIs so they are as secure as possible. So in order to do this, we've done what we always do, which is gather a masterclass level of panelists to talk you through these issues. So let's meet our panel. Could I welcome Barry O'Donoghue? Now, Barry is the co-founder and CEO of Radium, which supplies APIs to central banks, to banks and fintechs around the world. So Radium is one of the world's most advanced companies in this area. So Barry, wonderful to have you with us.
Great to be here, Charles. Thank you.
Great. I'd like to welcome John Heaton Armstrong, who is, well, he calls himself a consultant. It'd be better to say in his illustrious career, he's spent his life at the cutting edge of organizational security, in particular, API security. So yeah, he is one of the world's leading experts in this area. John, great to have you with us.
Thanks very much, John.
And to complete the panel, we have Dr. Ritesh Jain, who's been with us before on FinTech Talk. Ritesh is the founder of Infinite, which humanizes credit and credit cards. But he is a general all-round brain on FinTech issues. Ritesh, great to have you with us, sir.
Thank you, Charles. Pleasure to be here.
Great. And hi to everyone on LinkedIn. And if you would like to ask questions, if you're on Zoom, put your question in the chat and we can ask the panel. So let's just set the scene here. I mean, Barry, there's a great article on Forbes published about 3 days ago looking at API security. There's a great stat I'm just going to pull out. Study of finance and insurance cybersecurity practitioners. 1 out of 5 respondents have had a security problem. I mean, that's absolutely massive, isn't it? But I just set the scene for us because people may be watching thinking, API security, is that a major issue? I mean, how serious is this for organizations?
Well, thank you, Charles. Well, incredibly, I think is probably the adjective to use. APIs are, as you've said, at the heart of our modern hyper-connected digital worlds. They are ubiquitous. They're everywhere, and they are the connective tissue that power our digital lives. So I guess probably to level set, what we're most well known for is our work with central banks and sector regulators around the world. Our technology is at the heart of these ecosystems. So we provide central trust and security platform underpinning essentially national level regulated open banking, open finance programs. And that affects every bank, every insurer, every customer and every business in that market. And from our earliest work in the UK 8 years ago with the open banking implementation entity, there are now 250 fintechs across 90 account providers, banks, serving 11 million consumers and 1 in 5 SMEs. So it's very much operating at scale. It's coming up on its 7th anniversary. And just to give you a sense, in our largest ecosystem in Brazil, for the central bank there, we secure 2 billion API calls per week for almost 50 million consumers across 1,000 legal entities. But beyond regulated data sharing that central banks around the world are thinking about, and this is a global phenomenon, we see many different approaches on the private side, on the private sector side, that are not really or nearly as secure as their regulated equivalents. And that increases risk to business and consumers. And that's really why we're here today to talk about that particular aspect.
Sure. John, perhaps you just give people a feel for the variety of implementations, because a lot of people assume, well, APIs? Isn't there just, I don't know, one standard? I'm going to assume a lot of people watching this really have no idea of the different variety and flavors of API security. So perhaps you just tell us something about that and maybe even just mention what API is.
That's a good question. So your first question first. It is, and you could probably plot the distribution of securitization on a curve. At one end, you'd have almost nothing, so an unprotected resource, something that you can access freely. And at the other end, you might have something that's not exposed publicly and is behind very, very strong protection. So the sort of thing that might exist in the defense space. Neither of those scenarios is great if you want to commercialize your offering. So the challenge to market is to work out, based on the sensitivity of the resource being offered, what's appropriate but not inhibiting to doing business with their clients. Your second question was what is FAPI? FAPI is a standard that's built on OAuth 2. So OAuth 2 is a framework for authenticating and authorizing access to APIs. And as a result of the collaboration of literally thousands of people, FAPI is an addition to that standard, which says where you're using APIs in the context of financial services, here is a set of things to do. And practically speaking, what that means is that software that you implement as an organization that offers APIs will conform to that standard. So a very large number of experts have coalesced on what's appropriate for securing financial service APIs, and then software providers have gone out and built their services in line with that standard.
Is it fair to think of it as the gold standard?
I don't really. I think gold standard's a bit difficult because you could always make things more secure, but to interacting with clients. So the analogy I always give is if you want to ride a horse, you wouldn't put it in Fort Knox because it would make it very difficult to ride the horse. So there is a balance to be struck. So I think the gold standard, I don't think is the right phrase. I would say the most appropriate standard, yes, absolutely.
Okay, that's a really good nuance and distinction. Thank you. And Ritesh, I mean, we have a global audience here. Just again, frame this for us. People may be thinking, maybe it's overkill to devote a whole issue to, API security. Maybe a lot of people aren't interested in this, but just put it into context for us, Ritesh. If someone's working in fintech, how important is it that they understand API security?
Needless to say, and thanks, Charles, and what Barry and John has defined in terms of the API security and how critical it is, I can only add that when you talk about fintech runs, the blood is the API, which is running through the fintechs, right? So basically, fintechs are surviving on the APIs, and these APIs are basically means of communication of the services between the different institutions or the different services that fintech provides. So let's talk about a fintech which is offering a lending service or an account service or even account aggregation service. So I will not just talk about the open banking over here because the whole concept about the open banking came in play because of the fintech. So fintech has worked as a catalyst for banks to unleash and unlock their potential. And that's where the open banking came, where third-party providers, like any fintech providers, can consume the services and build product and services on top of that and offer to the customer. So for an example, like if an account aggregation, typical account aggregation, which is basically a customer can see multiple accounts in a single application, that is coming through the multiple APIs from the banks. Yeah. So in nutshell, whether you are lending, whether it's a payment or any other services in the fintech, that is surviving on the API. So yes, the security of the API is pretty critical, whether it's for the financial institution or even for the non-financial institutions.
Okay, thank you. And okay, Barry, let's nail it. What are organizations doing wrong when it comes to API security?
Well, it might not necessarily be wrong. It just might not be good enough. And that's probably the issue. I guess APIs, are fueling innovation by enabling enterprises to distribute their services with developers and partners to create new value and higher, ultimately, shareholder return. Businesses that engage in API ecosystems are, I think, in terms of stats, I think something like 24% more profitable, right? APIs unlock opportunities to develop these platform business models, to orchestrate their ecosystems, bring partners and third parties in, to ultimately extend the reach of what they do and to generate higher revenues so they can innovate more rapidly. Maybe they can accelerate omni-channel strategies. They can optimize internal processes, engage partners, reach new audiences, things of that nature. What are they getting wrong? It's probably, APIs is a multifaceted aspect. Ultimately, they're trying to expose APIs that are useful. They're trying to extend their reach so that they can be consumed seamlessly and securely. And I guess this is done through ultimately an excellent developer experience, because they are the consumers ultimately of APIs, and they need simple, seamless, self-service interfaces that they can use to define their software app, to declare their services, to obtain authentication credentials in the form of digital certificates, so they can authenticate and authorize their application. And they need to be able to discover and connect quickly to the parties that are exposing the data providers, most often banks, but this could also be insurance and business and wealth and investment. So I think there's opportunities to revisit the security model and perhaps take reference from the FAPI standard that's being applied across 13 markets and growing globally. There's a reason why that's the case. And I think the mainstay of API security approaches today in the non-regulated space is nowhere near as secure. And I think that represents a problem, because what we're observing, that the article sort of highlights, is that there are more motivated, well-motivated, well-organized, well-funded groups that are seeking to capture some opportunities, right? And they're looking at players that are exposing these interfaces, and they're looking for opportunities to monetize them, right? By creating a scaled attack, by a ransomware, by a data breach. And therefore, yeah, APIs are an important thing to protect at the highest level, especially if you're doing high assurance data sets, be it financial services or beyond.
Okay. And John, just please continue to elaborate. I mean, just talk us through some of the vulnerabilities and types of attacks that APIs can face.
Well, it's a good question. They're very similar to the sort of attacks that people can face, because broadly speaking, for most organizations, the method of authenticating is exactly the same. An API will challenge or will receive a username and password, and it will validate that against a credential store. So credential theft is probably the biggest attack vector. I think it's an interesting point, because most people will have experienced relatively significant change on how they access different services online. So MFA is pretty common now. And I think people, generally speaking, would find it very odd if they were accessing something sensitive like their bank account or making a payment, and they didn't have an additional challenge beyond a password. But clearly, a service calling an API can do thousands of transactions a minute, which a person can't. So the fact that most APIs still only rely on the digital equivalent of a username and password is quite, I'd say it's quite concerning. And it means that so your question was about how do they get breached? Well, it's a very easy way to breach an organization. If you can access the credentials, and you've got the keys to the kingdom.
Great. But Barry, I just want to come back to something you said. I mean, I entered this conversation assuming that an upgrade would involve a software purchase, or you install some new widget and it upgrades your protocols, but it sounds from what you're saying, it's actually much more complicated than that. It's about an entire developer experience that is required.
I think developer experience is important to get right and to have some attention to that, because making sure that developers can consume your services is important to the distribution of them. But the security aspects of the consumption is, as John alludes to, is, you've got API keys and secrets, which are analogous to usernames and passwords. Developers need those to consume those services. I guess FAPI as a model essentially prevents and outlaws the use of API keys and secrets and mandates the use of asymmetric keys and cryptography instead as a way to authenticate and authorize access. So that's a massive step up right there, because instead of, for example, in the case of essentially these API keys and secrets, which are usernames and passwords being sent over the wire every time, where they can be captured and replayed by an unauthorized party, you're instead using a set of keys that you retain locally, that you never send over the wire, and that you use each time to compute a one-time code that is used to authorize your access. The other aspect, which we should come on to talk about, the most prevalent way that APIs are secured today, is what's called an access token. So it's a token-based access approach, and that is essentially, to use an analogy, it's like finding £5 on the street, right, and picking it up and taking it into the nearest shop and purchasing a bar of chocolate. Okay, the shopkeeper does not care whether that £5 is genuinely yours or whether you found it on the street. They are going to accept it because you are the bearer, and they are obliged to accept, and they have no idea. So a big part of a stronger authorization security model that FAPI introduces is, instead of having what's termed a bearer access token, which essentially entitles the person who bears the token to access the resource that it protects, you're essentially binding and sender constraining that access token. So it prevents someone who has captured it in the ether, maybe in a log file or in another data breach, to present it as the authorized party. Those checks are essentially mitigated. So there's a number of attack vectors that the FAPI security model, and in particular, has conceived in a formal threat analysis that's been produced at a university, is public, and that demonstrates that these attack vectors are mitigated. So these are some of the things that, again, as I say, sophisticated attackers are looking for opportunities, and they're looking for the lowest hanging fruit, ultimately, where the work factor for the payoff is the right balance. Low work, high payoff, and that payoff could be a valuable, it could be a pounds and pence thing where they can compromise a value-based API, or it might just be an exfiltration of high-value data that they can monetize in a different channel.
Cracking. Yeah, we're really making the case here of how important this subject is. I want to get onto the mechanics of how we upgrade, but first of all, let's just deal with the business case. I mean, Ritesh, when it comes to marketing services, I'm going to assume here that there's a valuable commercial point to be made, that if organizations are negotiating, if a fintech is talking to a bank or has a particular service, that the subject of API security is going to come up. I mean, Ritesh, just sell this to us. Can this be a competitive advantage for an organization if they say, yeah, we conform to the FAPI standards, we've reviewed our API protocols, and we think we're cutting edge? I mean, is that currently a good sales pitch?
Definitely, Charles. In terms of the API, if we talk about the evolution in last decade, right, we have seen a significant transformation where we are talking about the API first designs, API first architectures. We are talking about API as a service, API security as a service. Right. So there have been quite a lot of transformation in the space, and for obvious reason, because API is not just for exposing the services. Basically, API means business. It means monetization. It gives money. It generates revenues, right? So if I take you back on the 14 years back, we started building data as a service within Visa, right? And we exposed our APIs pretty much later on, around 2016, and we started generating significant revenue from them. Now, yes, it is definitely a heck of a pitch if you talk about, like, I've got one of the most secured APIs in place, because as rightly Barry said about somebody having access to the API, and it's like the token and presentation of the token. Now let's talk about the API carries a significant amount of data and the information as well. So like homomorphic sort of encryption, right? That is basically for your secure data or the sensitive data that you carry through the APIs. So there are a variety of the methods which have been implemented over the period of time, but as John rightly said, there is a no gold standard as such. You can go as far as you say, yes, we think that we have got the most of it. And when you say FAPI has covered most of it based on the current standards and the protocols and fix the vulnerabilities as well. So it's a pretty good pitch if you say like, I've got a secured APIs and they are FAPI standards. That's the standard in the industry today.
Good. So it sort of pays for itself. I mean, John, I'm interested in how painful it is to upgrade. We know in fintech, some things are absolutely agony. You know, moving on to a new core banking system is total misery. It takes years to do, and everyone groans. You mention it. Other things like, you know, a new fraud service can be done in a few days or weeks. How painful is it to upgrade API technology and practices in an organization?
Well, the short answer is it depends. But it largely depends on factors which are business context specific, as opposed to that relate to the software that enables a change. So I would say that there's very good support in market for enabling purchase of services to enable a change. You can go to the OpenID Foundation website, and they have long lists of providers who have certified their products as conforming to the different standards, be it FAPI or otherwise. So that isn't hard. You know, you can select a vendor based on where you host your infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. The difficulties will always come in managing transition, but that's as you referred to in you know, the example of changing a core banking system. Any form of change to a live system is likely to be challenging. It's just a question of managing it carefully. I think what I would say is that the longer that you don't change, the more painful it becomes. And what I've seen through experience is that whilst, you know, change is always difficult, the ROI that you get on moving to a system which enables self-service management of credentials, which is less brittle, and which moves you ahead of the curve when it comes to securing these type of resources, you know, you get that ROI very quickly. I think that the most interesting case, which most people don't think about, is when you're having to interface with some form of interested stakeholder, so a prospective client, a national regulator, an insurance broker, and they ask you how your resources are secured. Well, as soon as you say, well, I default to the industry standard, that is the end of the conversation. So that benefit isn't always perceived at the outset, but it is very real.
Terrific. And Barry, you've dealt with many of these situations, I suppose. Just talk us through it. I mean, John gave us a great overview there of what it's like. So if someone's watching this and think, you know, I work for an organization, we need to do something, but God, maybe let's put it on the back burner because it sounds absolutely horrible. What's it actually like upgrading APIs?
So, as John says, many of the off-the-shelf products in the market today, of which we're not a provider, deal with these concerns out of the box. Right. So the components that typically anybody who's engaging in the API economy and exposing APIs today will have a component that performs the role of the authorization server in OAuth 2 terms. And they will also have what's called a resource server in the form of an API gateway. They'll probably have one or both of those things that performs those functional roles. And those components have the option to work and operate in a more secure fashion. However, typically they are configured to operate in a less secure fashion. So I think, first of all, this session is really about awareness and generating some awareness to review your API security posture and to assess the maturity of your existing security model. in particular around how you are onboarding your third parties, how you are securing your APIs, and to, for example, have a look at the threat models that relate to OAuth 2 implementations, to review the options that you have configured, and to perhaps consider the risks that those options present to your organization. So it's not necessarily, we're not advocating here for a rip and replace of some existing technology solution. It's more about being more alert to the configurable options that are available in commercial products that you're probably already using today, to up the ante in terms of your security model, to make the work factor much higher for attackers that might look to take advantage of that and compromise your systems by perhaps obtaining, obtaining somebody else's API keys and secrets, or stealing an access token and misusing that on their behalf to obtain unauthorized access, or many other potential attack vectors. So there's a playbook that, and the FAPI security profile and threat analysis and the best current practice, which is an open standard which is constantly kept up to date. That is a clear a blueprint to guide an implementer to say, right, there's loads of implementation choices here, and I could make some really poor ones, but here's what the best current practice in the industry says, and let's look for those options in the tools we're already using today. And if they're not available, then have a conversation with your suppliers. And if you need some help, you can give Radium a call. We'd be happy to assist.
Nice. So a lot of business decisions to be made. So it's not just a purely technology decision. I mean, Ritesh, just talk us through maybe some of the trade-offs here. I mean, as John said, the most secure solution is not always the most practical from a business perspective. So just perhaps, Ritesh, give us an idea of some of the trade-offs here, some of the business decisions to be made around APIs. It's a difficult question, I know.
No, it's pretty standard when we talk in terms of the regulated or even an unregulated environments, right? When you talk about the banks or the financial institutions, or generally in the enterprises, right? There's a mindset, if it's not broken, let's not change it. We need to get out of that mindset first. If it's not broken, doesn't mean it doesn't need change. It needs upgrade. It needs reinforcements, and that's what we need to look into. And especially when it comes down to the API, it is more of a matter of interoperability, because you are having a services exposed to API which are going to be consumed by multiple service providers who are consuming your services to commercialization or even for non-commercialization. So you got to be careful when you're upgrading these APIs. None of the services are getting disrupted. At the same time, whether we are really utilizing the right standards and whether we are following the standards. So there's a lot more focus on the security. And let me give you an example about a non-regulated environment, right? I'm sure you must be seeing quite a lot of threats, a lot of attacks, or the ransomware. I'll take you back in 2016 and 17, one of the largest enterprise, which was one of the largest shipping company, got attacked and by a ransomware, and which costed that enterprise 300 million. I'm talking about Maersk over here. And so think about it, it's your security matters significantly, and especially in an environment where you are exposing your services not only for the consumption for third parties, but basically you are consuming services from the third parties as well, whether they are your service provider or even the software provider. So you got to have a very secure base and multi-level security. So it is a mission critical for any organization, small or big, doesn't matter.
That's great. Barry, I can see you nodding away there. Just talk to us about, the business case here, because as Ritesh said, if you get hacked, you're in serious trouble, and the budget you could have spent on, reviewing API security is, dwarfed by the potential reputational failure, cache failure, regulatory intervention, ... So yeah, what's the, impact on revenue and on risk of not paying attention to APIs?
Yeah, well, I think I'll have a first go, and then John from his CISO background can have another go and give you a different perspective. But clearly, the impacts and the risk of impact, has to be considered. It can be high in regulatory censure in terms of, actual penalties and fines in terms of reputational damage. So that's clear. So those costs have to be borne in mind. I think the stats you don't have to look very far to find the stats. So it requires attention to make sure that you're protecting. I think I've lost my train of thought. Give me the sense of the question again. I had an answer.
Yeah, just the impact on revenue, on the
revenue,
the cost of risk. Yeah, but revenue in particular. Yeah, the kind of business opportunity here, because we're presenting it as just a security nice thing, but it's not that, is it? It's about being a company that can generate opportunities. That's a good company to work with.
Indeed. I jotted down a few terms and now you've jogged my memory. Thank you very much. So we are in the business of trust, actually, in enabling distributed trust between parties. So, and if you think of financial services, it's all about trust. It's about security, it's about stability, resilience, and ultimately confidence of your consumers, but also the parties that you do business with. So it's critical to make sure that you don't, behave in a way that could undermine that, because that can be catastrophic from a business perspective, from a consumer confidence perspective, and can actually be material from an existential perspective. So I think it's important to make sure that these items are top of mind, and that you have an information security, risk and audit and compliance effort that focuses on your API channel and makes sure that you're giving it the right level of attention. I probably would hand off to John in terms of his CISO background, because this is something that he has directly dealt with at the C-suite.
Thanks, Barry. I think it's something that you can quantify. As a CISO and also as a board member, the risks that you're always worried about are those where the impact is extremely high. So I'm sure there's an analogy, but essentially, if this risk becomes manifest, the likelihood of it or otherwise is irrelevant. It has a relatively binary impact, and that is a catastrophic one. Either you suffer it or you don't, but when you do, all bets are off. So as you can imagine, whether sitting in a board or acting as a CISO, those are risks that you're heavily motivated to mitigate very, very effectively. So there's two ways that you can mitigate them. There's control, and that's essentially what we've been talking about today. And, my opinion is that the control is actually relatively easy to implement and relatively easy to engage with, precisely because it's a standard. Nothing that we've spoken about today means any customization, means doing anything that isn't extremely well documented and supported in market, that isn't understood by hundreds, if not thousands of people. So that to me sounds like a really good scenario. I can introduce this control, can massively impact the likelihood of this risk becoming manifest, and it's not very difficult to do. That's a sort of a golden opportunity for a CISO. The other way of mitigating this type of risk is a very commercially determined one, and that's insurance. But the way insurers work is by setting premiums based on assessments of markets. So, you asked earlier about whether or not this is a gold standard, and I said, well, there are degrees. The reality is that the worse you are relatively, the higher your premium is likely to be. That's what you get as a driver. If you crash your car a lot, well, you get a high insurance premium. So if you secure your estate poorly, you get a high insurance premium. So again, doing something relatively cheap and easy, which results in a lower insurance premium, or you can increase the scope of your insurance so you can have a higher liability. That, from a CISO's point of view, is an absolute golden opportunity.
Right. We do actually have a question from the audience, which I just want to get in. Question for Barry, which is, we touched on this a little bit earlier, which is what changes have some of the market leaders implemented very broad question that. But maybe you talk about market leaders, maybe some of the best programs you've seen. What were the hallmarks of those programs?
Good question. Well, I think there's a few things. What we are seeing in developed, regulated markets, like, for example, in the UK, like in Brazil, like in Australia and others, is that they have had the journey of the regulated access to their APIs and meeting the standards to secure those APIs. And what they're looking at is how do they apply, instead of doing a completely different security model for their non-regulated, discretionary, premium commercial APIs, whatever you want to call it, they're thinking actually this model actually should apply across the board, across every API that we expose. And we're seeing that major banking groups and fintechs are actually investing in a security model that is consistent with that, because it's a familiar security model that everybody in the market is already using today. So there's benefits to that because it's more of the same. There's a governance risk and compliance angle, because if you think of exposing a non-regulated service to a discretionary third party, it's not the regulator that's saying you must open access and just enable it. It's a discretionary thing that you have to consider for yourself, for your organization. And typically that would prompt an information security review and an audit, and quite a long-winded process, and maybe a long contract. And it would take months, and that ultimately impedes the ability to actually onboard that third party and actually to drive some activity and some value chains. So having a consistent model that you're already comfortable with on a regulated basis allows you to pivot to discretionary premium commercial APIs using the same sort of standards. And what we're seeing is these banking groups are looking at this model to essentially orchestrate their own ecosystems, their own platform business model, to extend the reach and the distribution of what they're already good at, and to drive additional consumption, additional stickiness, and additional benefits through to third parties for their end consumers, and to make themselves more relevant in their world. So that's what we're actually seeing happen. And also generally just, I guess, reviewing their API security maturity and making sure that they are operating at a high standard, commensurate with the value of the data assets that they are surfacing to the third parties they're exposing them to.
Okay, well, we're almost finished the session, so I'm just going to one quick fire question each. Ritesh, just sum up the importance of this. We began with a news item saying 1 in 5 organizations has been hit by a security breach related to APIs. I mean, people watching this, should they be going into work tomorrow and raising this at board level?
Definitely they should be, and they should be looking back into their backyard to understand what is the risk that they are carrying, as well as John has rightly pointed out, it's all about the risk management, as well as the more you invest, the better insured you are. And not in terms of the cybersecurity insurance, it's basically insurance in terms of the quality of the product that you're exposing to your customers.
Gosh. John, if people want to learn more about this, where should they go? What useful resources are there? I mean, we talk about OpenID. I mean, there's, OAuth has a lot of coverage online. What do you recommend as the next stage for people watching this and think, yeah, I'd really like to bone up on this and become an expert?
I think you've said it. You could do a lot worse than the OpenID Foundation. There's a lot of very enthusiastic people like me who are very happy to talk to anyone about this until they don't want to talk about it anymore. So, but I'd start with the OpenID Foundation.
And Barry, I mean, your organization helps central banks and world's leading banks and fintechs with this subject. What do organizations do? Just pick up the phone and say, hello, Radium, we think we might have a problem. How does the conversation begin?
That could be a way. But, if you're going back to the office tomorrow, you might take the action to review your current posture and API security model. I think it's incredibly important to be alive to the changing sort of dynamic. So undertake a review with reference to the OpenID Foundation is a good reference point. The OAuth 2, which is the definitive standard that secures APIs, and particularly what's called the BCP, the best current practice. This is an open definition of the kinds of configurable options that you should have in place to have the best current practice from a security perspective. If you're more interested to understand about the threats and the things that could go wrong and do go wrong, well, we could signpost some of the articles as we have done for this talk today, but there is a formal threat analysis that talks about specifically the weaknesses of some of these security protocols, and it would be useful to, with reference to that, consider how your existing security protocol and ultimately do a risk assessment. That's a good starting point. And if you're unsure, yes, give us a call. We'd be happy to talk about it.
Cracking. Okay, well, we ambitiously set out to give people a crash course in API security. I think miraculously we have done it. My knowledge has risen exponentially. This is such an important subject, and a lot of people had a hazy awareness of what needs to happen. But hopefully we've added some detail, some nuance, and yeah, I think we've covered it thoroughly and brilliantly. So from myself, thank you so much. From Barry, from John, from Ritesh, and everyone here at FinTech Talk, thank you so much for watching. See you next time.